Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, often with guests, and spoiler alert, we have a guest today, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And usually I warm up to these things, but in fact, you know our guest, because if you listened last week, you will have heard from our guest. We are very, very pleased to have Oliver Lee back with us. In the first episode, which again, we draw the curtain back on some of this, was actually a number of weeks ago now. So it's probably useful for us as well as the listeners to do a little bit of a recap. It left me thinking about these topics afterwards, where Oliver shared his insights from his experience in the Royal Marines and to some degree the civilian world, and that's a little bit which we'll touch on more today. And we talked about leadership, integrity, moral courage. We talked a lot about organizational culture, and it's interesting to see how we seem to be similarly passionate about this term, which we don't. I think we talked about the fact that organizational culture isn't a poster you put on your wall, where perhaps it's seen as that by many people. And we talked about making difficult decisions when values are challenged. And I know that we'll talk a little bit more about this today. And Oliver, you were very kind. You talked about your early leadership experiences. I very much enjoyed your story of revolution at your primary school. Was it primary school into secondary school?
No, it was my primary school. And I'm sure it's a little bit like somebody scoring a try that was actually from 2 meters and ends up being from 30 meters in your mind. But it was a special moment that I've always looked back on and smiled about a little bit. So yes, I was glad to be able to tell that story.
Early indications of leadership potential, and an excellent story about the time that you reintroduced British Bulldog or whatever it was called.
Nothing more than potential, but yes, agreed. And we did get British Bulldogs reinstated, which was a very good outcome.
We went into things like individual and institutional moral courage, how to maintain integrity when faced with a different, easier path. I suspect these are themes we'll come back to. Obviously, we talked about your organizing of the protest, but also your journey into the Royal Marines and your time in the Royal Marines, and of course, your time in Afghanistan, and how you then left the Royal Marines based on the difference in your values and perhaps the organizational culture, or certainly aspects of organizational culture. I particularly enjoyed sort of the philosophy and experiences coming together, putting your men first. And I think if I remember rightly, we had quite a spirited conversation about how this sounds easy, and it's the sort of thing that you can read in books and say, putting your people first, but your passionate belief in how important it really is to put them first and what you get from it. In other words, not that it's the morally right thing to do necessarily on its own, but morally and operationally and culturally, the benefits sort of roll through there. So we talked an awful lot about your time in the Royal Marines. First of all, thank you for coming back.
Pleasure.
Perhaps now we can go back into, so you've now left the Royal Marines. Presumably it's time for you to relax, enjoy your life, perhaps a little bit of gardening, and some more time with the family. What happened after that? Where did you go after that?
Yes, I mean, that's a good way to start the conversation, Chris. Thank you. And thank you for the summary of our previous discussions, which similarly I enjoyed considerably. I thought they were excellent. I didn't find it a terribly relaxing moment to answer the question head on. I was deeply unhappy and sad by what had happened, and what had therefore led me to take this extraordinary decision to resign from and leave the Royal Marines, which wasn't a decision that either I or my family, in the most extended sense of the word, or indeed any friends of mine, had expected me to take. And so it didn't feel relaxing or sort of an opportunity, as you put it, to kick back a bit and do some gardening. I think, to express it adequately, it kind of felt like two things. Firstly, how do I cope with the fact that my belief system in the workplace, which has essentially defined me for the last 2 decades, has been tantamount to dismantled? And I don't say that in a hyperbolic way. I mean, that is exactly how it felt. How will I operate going forward? What will I do? With who? For what reasons? Motivated by which factors? Dot 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 dot. So that was a very big thing on my mind, and I was extremely. My eyes were open to that, and I was worried about it, and I was right to be worried about it, because it's proven to be the case. And then the second element was much less philosophical and far more practical. What am I going to do? I'm not sitting on a large amount of money. I've got 2 boys. I've got a wife who, courtesy of supporting my military career to this point, isn't currently working. We don't have somewhere to live. We're not sure where we're going to send our children to school. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I left university and went straight into the Royal Marines. So I've never had a CV. I've never had a kind of exposure to the opportunities available beyond the military. So what does all of this mean? And it was kind of those two things that I remember feeling as the principal emotions. There were some other emotions, such as it felt a little bit like a bereavement. I felt angry about it. I felt upset about it. I felt embarrassed in myself that my brother's death by suicide felt no worse. This felt as bad as that, which I deeply disliked in myself, because clearly the former should be much worse than the latter, but you can't kind of control how you're feeling yourself. And so all of that needed to be coped with. And so what happened from there was, for a week or two, I suspect I was just very, very low indeed, and didn't really do very much, and relied heavily on friends and family to kind of carry me through those couple of weeks. And then I went into a completely chaotic phase, which was misguided in the extreme with retrospect, where I charged around all over the place, talking to anybody who was prepared to talk to me, thinking, God, I need a job. I'll literally talk to anybody. And then I've talked about this once before. I had an instructive day, in that I went to see somebody who'd been a mentor of mine when I was working in the Ministry of Defence for the Chief of Defence Staff, who was called Rob Fulton, General Sir Rob Fulton, a senior Royal Marines officer, who I classed both as a very senior man, but also as a friend. And I went into London and I saw him in his office, and the first thing he did was tick me off for calling him sir. He said, that's not necessary, which instantly put me at my ease and was a very warm way to start the whole thing. And then he said, look, you've just got to go home. You need to put a wet towel around your head. You need to have a glass of wine with your wife, because you can't do this on your own. So do it as a couple. And you need to work out what you want to do. And then you will sound much less chaotic, and I'm sure you'll get a good job that will launch you into the sort of second stage of your career. The most simple advice you could possibly imagine. There's nothing radical or Einsteinish about that, but the best advice I could possibly have been given at the time. And because I have some respect for my elders and betters, I followed it to the letter. So I did go home, and I thought on the train on the way home, I will do exactly that. And that's precisely what we did. So I sat down and worked out, well, what is it that I want to do? And I thought I wouldn't have left the Royal Marines but for these extraordinary circumstances. Otherwise, by choice, I would still be doing that. So what I actually want to do is try and replicate that. And I then thought, what's the happiest and most fulfilling thing I did in the Royal Marines? And the answer by a country mile was commanding 4-5 Commando. And so I thought, well, I'd actually quite like to do that. And so I decided that what I wanted to do, which was a stretch, and some people said, this is not going to be easy, which was true and is true, because I didn't have the provenance in some respects. But I decided that what I wanted to do was run organisations in a civilian context, just as I'd run 4-5 Commando in a military context. And therefore, I decided I was only going to apply for CEO jobs, which limited the field quite dramatically, quite quickly.
Did you question at that point whether civilian organisations were the same or different to military organisations? Because it's such a fascinating thing. I have many friends who've left the military, and whether they left it unexpectedly early or whether they had planned it, to a man and woman, they've all said to me, I have no idea what skills I have. Surely these can't be transferable. And of course, they've realised they are. So did you, applying for a CEO role, did you think, well, my CV talks about 4-5 Commando where I was the CEO of 4, or did you sort of scratch your head and say, is there overlap?
That's a great question. And, some is history thereafter in terms of the answer to it. But answering the question head on, Chris, I mean, how did I feel about it at the time? Gareth will be smiling a little bit here because he knows me a little bit of old. Without being immodest, I felt that I had a massive amount of transferable skill. That's the position I adopted. I wasn't convinced that people would be able to see that or imagine that or picture that, but I was completely certain. I mean, I'd led people at a whole series of different levels, to include large numbers in very challenging circumstances, as kind of one element of my career. And the other element of my career had been in an advisory capacity in senior roles on the strategic landscape in Whitehall, working for ministers and others. And I couldn't really imagine a world where that wasn't at least interesting to people. And I try and explain this to people because I get asked often by excellent people leaving the military, not just the Royal Marines, much more broadly than that. And I've never been a sort of I'm only a Royal Marine type person. I think that the military isn't necessarily a kind of patchwork quilt of different capabilities. And goodness me, didn't I learn that in Afghanistan? By no means could the Royal Marines do it all. You needed all sorts of capabilities. And I talk to those people a lot, particularly when they ask me to do so, when they're in the process of leaving. And I slightly try and bolster their confidence, not in a pushy or an arrogant way. I wouldn't advise them to be like that. And there are the odd one over the years who've fallen into that category, which doesn't necessarily help the reputation of service leavers. But I think generally they have a vast amount to offer. They've done a huge number of challenging, demanding, under pressure, interesting things. And I think those things can be transitioned in a reasonably straightforward way. My experience of it was that I had a very fortunate introduction to a big executive search firm called Odgers Berndtson by an old friend of mine who'd commanded the Navy, called Jonathan Band. He introduced me to Odgers Berndtson, and I started talking to them about the possibility of running one of the big homeless charities, which appealed to me greatly for all kinds of reasons, not least the challenges certain people experience when leaving the military, some of whom actually become homeless. And partway through that process, which I was in a discussion with Odgers about, I got the message that the client, the organization, had made the decision that they were not interested in having anybody who didn't have a social care background, which immediately taught me, right, I need to be, there's some round holes, round pegs at play here, and it's not going to be perfectly translatable, and it's not going to be perfectly able to transition. But as luck would have it, that had kind of got me onto the radar screen at Odgers Berndtson. I think they thought that I was kind of not completely mad and somebody that they could deal with a little bit going forward. And then a different approach came into them from a different client, where essentially the FTSE chairman, who had been the chairman of Poundland when it floated, very, very successful, terrific man called Colin Smith, still a very good friend of mine. And he said he was the chairman of the Challenge at the time, and he said to Odgers Berndtson, that they quoted this back to me. He said, I don't care where this person comes from. I don't care about the sector or the background, quote unquote. They can come from the moon if needs be. I just want a leader. And that was just the most perfect timing for me, because I was leaving on the sort of ticket of being a leader. And I think if they hadn't been given that instruction, if they'd been given a narrower, more traditional, more stovepiped instruction, they wouldn't have looked at me at all for the job. But the fact they were given such a broad, such an imaginative set of riding instructions meant that somebody like me could go into the mix, and I ended up getting the job, and the rest is history.
That's wonderful. I think there's something in that in terms of the employment world, and when you're trying to find that job, is based really heavily around CVs, around skills, around demonstrable skills and experience. And I think it highlights the importance of having the right mindset and attitude, because actually skills are something that can be learned or taught or developed, but actually having the right attitude, mindset is far more important. Given that when I transitioned from the Royal Marines, I did it on far more deliberate terms. So I gave my 12 months notice and I went through the career transition program. And a lot of that was very, very helpful, because it did things like allow you to explore what you've done in the military and then rewrite that into a language that a civilian employer might understand. And it also did things where you were set challenges around rewriting your CV from the perspective of somebody reading it. And those were really, really useful things that over that 12 months got me to be thinking about how I could sell myself to a prospective employer. You didn't have that benefit of that. How much of the transition from the military to your post-military civilian career, how much did that work, and how much was that based on you having to make it work, and how much was that based on the military just being very, very similar to, leadership is leadership? So I suppose what I'm asking there is, how difficult was it?
Yeah, it was quite difficult. And I mean, it's slightly hard to explain, actually, because, in one sense, I'm saying to you that I was reasonably confident that I had a set of skills that could be transferred and brought to reasonable effect in the civilian domain. That's definitely true. In another sense, I'm saying to you, I was incredibly daunted, extremely worried, immensely apprehensive, and didn't really know what was going to happen. In a third sense, I'm saying to you that my whole sort of belief system in the professional workplace had slightly disintegrated. And then I suppose I'd add a fourth. I did put a CV together, of course, because you have to. And I'd never had one before, so I didn't really know where to start. And I sent it to somebody who was advising me at the time. And it sort of talked about all sorts of things like, the Sword of Honour and working for the Secretary of State for Defence and youngest full colonel and all this kind of stuff. And he said, that's completely irrelevant to my organisation. I'm not interested in that at all. I'm quite interested that you went to Cambridge because it suggests you've got a half decent brain. But the following 18 years, I'm not interested in at all. You're going to have to repackage that completely.
I'm going to attempt to ruin this for both of you, which is, I think both of you, and I've seen this, I mean, many years ago in my own transition, but also with some more recent friends doing this, which is, I think there's an assumption that the two of you had broadly made, which I would challenge. And that is, you are assuming that the job market, that people employing you are rational and predictable. And I think that actually one of the things I have learned over many years, and I've been in different organizations, is that is a fair place to start, but it's not the reality. So as you had said, someone who you knew said, this is what you should do, and knew who to go and talk to, and you navigated that part. And there are other people who would have been potentially very impressed with Sword of Honour because they knew what that meant, or working with the Secretary of State. My experience is that actually the job market is way less rational than we might imagine. And so organizations, you are already even assuming that the organizations hiring you have a very clear, well-refined and mature sense of what they need. And I can tell you from being within those organizations, often it is, Bob is leaving, we need a new Bob. And that's how it starts. And in fact, what's really interesting is they say, Bob has left, so we need a new Bob. And then you say, why did Bob leave? And all of a sudden, that's when you get to interesting stuff. So I think the approaches that you have taken have been very rational, but I think my experience has been you have to realize that's not always the case. And so I don't know, did you find yourself talking to organizations and thinking, hang on a minute, why are you even talking to me and why am I talking to you? Because the assumption that there's a match, hang on a minute, culturally you're in a different place, for example.
Yeah, there was a little bit of that, although I wouldn't say that was the principal problem, but there was certainly an element of that. And I recognise and agree with what you say, Chris. I think the bigger problem was that slightly thick-headedly, I assumed at that point in time that if in fairly straightforward English, so I wasn't talking in acronyms or military speak or jargon, if in fairly straightforward English, and this is something else I've discussed with many people who've transitioned after me, if in those terms I laid out my military career, people would bite into it and would understand exactly what it meant. The reality was they simply didn't. That was my fault, not theirs, because they just had no background in it or exposure to it. So I had to find a way of packaging it in a different way. And I remember that I can't remember which one it was, but one of the steps in the process it was a long and involved executive search run process for me to be appointed to the job at the Challenge, the one that got me going out of the military. And I can't remember which stage it was. But I was asked a question in there, which basically said, well, you don't know anything about money at all, do you? Because you've been in the military all your career. You've never run a P&L. You don't know what a balance sheet is. Cash flow is something you only understand with regards to your family. And how can you come and run a business with that sort of lack of background? And I answered fairly abrasively. And said, no, I think I do. I've done X, Y, and Z, A, B, C. The delightful chairman had a cup of coffee with me the week after and said, you did extremely well. You interviewed very well. You're into the next stage. Keep going. We think you're a very strong candidate, but don't defend the indefensible. Where you've got a shortcoming, just fess up to it. And that was the best advice possible. And
but I think that even that was fascinating, because I think you were genuine when you said you are describing these things. I have an equivalent which I think is just as demanding, just as taxing, and you might use different words. But actually, I believe I have I have to get funding for 4-5 Commando to appear in a certain place. And yet, maybe this is the point. What it seems to imply is people refuse to believe that the military was something that was analogous to their world. Is that a fair
No,
statement?
I think that's fair, and it's not so much about 4-5 Commando. I mean, the example I mainly used is that obviously when I was working for ministers, I played a significant part in the definition of the defence budget, which is big FTSE 100 level company, you know, close to 40 billion a year in those days and more now. And so I felt I really did understand money and the pressures of money and the pressures of whiteboard exercises where you have to take money out of the program and so on and so forth. But I think the bigger lesson was the expectation was that I did not understand those things. And so I needed to position it a bit differently. I needed to explain it more sensitively and more sophisticatedly, and I needed to be a bit more alive to the audience to whom I was speaking. I think those were the lessons, and they were good lessons, and I'm grateful for them to this day.
I think I agree with you, by the way, and that's about adaptation to sort of suit the new world. But I think it does highlight something which, in general terms, we almost can't resist assuming we are unique. Every business, and I've worked in many domains across my life, and I've seen the look on people's faces, which is you may bring some skills we don't have, but of course our business is unique and different. And I think that's a really interesting challenge that every business has to face and question. We're not trying to suggest you're not as special or as wonderful as you would like to think, but I think it's important to be realistic and say, as we're sort of discussing, leadership is leadership. Whether or not you have experience with a particular domain, strong leadership is actually almost more important than that domain expertise. It's very interesting, though, how businesses find it very difficult. Perhaps it's simply they don't have the context, but I've seen that far too many times, which is, but you don't understand we're somehow special or unique. And of course, statistically, that's probably highly unlikely.
Yeah, I think from the opposite point of view, though, one of the things I found about transitioning into the civilian world is there are things about the military that are very specific and unique that you don't notice until you leave. So it's a real strength in terms of how we form teams quickly is the standardization of language and the standardization of assumptions. And some of that is what you would call institutionalization, but you don't notice it happen particularly until you leave. And I think part of the problem is the military talk in a very particular way, they carry themselves in a very particular way, and they have a very particular sort of operating context, which quite often seems quite extreme, particularly when you're talking about leadership and management. And I think situating that in a civilian context can be quite difficult. But then there's just these really interesting sort of nuances that you don't notice until you make the mistake. And one of the things I found out the hard way was I was being perceived as being quite rude and blunt in the use of emails. And it's something I just didn't notice. But in the military, brevity is just part of what we do. So emails, you just start with, rank and name of the individual, issue at hand, send it off. And there's no sort of conversation around how are you doing, how's the family, how was your weekend, because you just, you're firing off emails left, right, and centre. And it's just another form of communications, which is a very military way of looking at it. And I learned the hard way that actually that comes across as quite blunt and quite rude. And I think these are just nuances that you have to learn.
Yes. So this is, and I was having conversations with people recently where it's about a different way of saying it is, I don't think it's about being nice or nuances. It's about being effective. How do you adapt to be the most effective? But I wonder, we need to take a quick break. We've been dancing around this. Oliver, I would love to sort of confront you with what perhaps for this podcast, at least, is maybe the most important question is, what did you see as the differences between the approaches to leadership and management in the military and civilian world? Our premise of this podcast is there is a lot more than you might imagine that overlaps. In fact, probably to a pretty significant degree. But as a man who's really done this at a high level, perhaps let's come back after the break and really challenge you with that and say, are there meaningful differences or is it fundamentally the same? And perhaps explore that. How about that?
Shall I give a quick shot at that before the break, now that you've got me thinking?
Look at the teaser. Did you see that there? Yes, please go ahead.
And then by all means, let's take a break. You've heard more than enough from me. I think it's an immensely interesting question. I think it goes to the heart of what leadership is, what matters about leadership, and what comprises leadership. And I also think it goes to the heart of something else that matters considerably, which is, to what extent are people who have served in the military prepared for and equipped then to lead beyond the military? And of course, it would be both worrying and very disappointing if the answer to that second question was, well, they aren't really. I think my example, my case, is quite an extreme one, because I went from a Royal Marines that was then, and I think pretty much still now, although I hope this will change, and I've always supported this change, that was 100% male. Petrifyingly early in my career, it was illegal to be anything other than heterosexual. Unfortunately, that changed during my career, but the stigma certainly didn't. And I would characterize the Royal Marines beyond those two factors as modestly right-leaning politically and relatively lowly educated by generalization. And I went to an organization that was 73% women, that was 13% LGBTQ, that was definitely left-leaning politically, quite clearly so, and that was very, very highly educated. So the average person, if they didn't have a PhD, they'd certainly been to a Russell Group university, and first-class degrees, etc., were all over the place. And I changed nothing. I didn't change a single thing by way of approach. And because it wasn't clear to people at this point, because I was slightly watching what was going to happen with regards to the whole Marine A case, and I hadn't yet been asked by his wife to help. So I'd been reasonably generic about my reasons for leaving the Royal Marines. I think people thought I was having a midlife crisis. And they said to me, well, how's leadership in Afghanistan of the 1,000+ men? There were actually a very small handful of brilliant women, but there weren't in 4-5 Commando, going to stack up against this rather bizarre organisation where everybody turns up with different coloured hair and shorts and trainers, and the rank structure is completely flat, and the demographic is profoundly different from anything you've experienced before. How's that going to work? They're not going to want to salute you. They're not going to want to call you sir or boss. And I thought, you're not quite understanding me, because I was pretty left of centre in the Royal Marines. I didn't greatly enjoy that grandness. I recognised that it went with the territory, in part for the reasons that Gareth described, because it's an idiosyncratic setup, and you have very profound responsibilities, and you can send people to prison, or you can fine them, or you can do all sorts of things that you can't do in a civilian leadership context. But I felt that, putting all of that to one side, I couldn't understand why the two things would be any different, because people are people, and they react to being inspired, being cared for, being looked after, being given a voice, being made a part of something that they feel is bigger than themselves, and so on and so forth. So it felt entirely natural to me to write a handwritten letter, and I used to do this many times a day, to a Marine in Yankee Company in 4-5 Commando who'd been bereaved. You know, I'm desperately sorry. I'm thinking of you. Can I help at all, Oliver? It felt exactly the same to do that in the challenge to a female member of staff who would never go anywhere near Afghanistan. But the approach didn't need to change at all. So I literally changed, and I mean this with absolute sincerity. This is not sort of revisionist history after the event. I changed nothing. It was another very big organisation. It was bigger than 4-5 Commando. It was thousands in the plural of people. And I led it in exactly the same way, and it worked.
Let's come back after the break. I'd love to sort of dive into that. You've almost implied that it was going to be smooth sailing from then on. I'm going to leave you with another thought just before we go to the break, because you've taken that thought and run with it, which is, do you think senior leadership in the best organizations could transition into the military? I'll leave you with that crazy thought.
That's a great question. Just to come back to your point, I'm certainly not suggesting that senior leadership is ever smooth sailing. I think by definition it's not. What I am saying is that I think senior leadership has some very common hallmarks, irrespective of where it's being discharged, that will either make it successful or less successful. And then I'm very happy to talk about your could it work the other way around question, which is a fascinating one, because the military for a long time has been a closed shop from that perspective.
I think so, and I think the question gets to the heart of, are these transferable skills? Fantastic. Then we will come back straight after the break and we'll dive in even more on those topics. See you in a second. Welcome back. Well, just before the break, we were talking about, actually, is the transition from military to civilian leadership role, actually, are there any differences? And I think you were arguing very well for the fact that at the very least there are way fewer differences than people might imagine. I know that when I sort of transitioned many years ago, I had one or two people saying, well, you're not in the military now. I don't know if you've come across that phrase. But I think what's really interesting is that does start to make this point that actually people at the very least don't understand the difference between the two. So perhaps going back to this, Oliver, so you're now in the civilian world, you're now leading an organization. Where did you see those things that either there was a really clear overlap between the two, and where were the differences, and what was the nuance you found? How did you tackle that shift from a green leadership with a uniform and the sort of, as you say, the person who comes in with the trainers or the different coloured hair?
Yeah, so I think that the differences were, I mean, and this is purely my opinion. I fully respect other opinions, and other people will have had different experiences as well. But I felt that the differences between the two were almost entirely superficial. You point to them a little bit in your question, Chris. You know, clearly one, you're regimentedly wearing a uniform, in the other you're not, and you're free to wear whatever you'd like on a particular day. Clearly one, there is a sort of regimented approach through which authority is vested, and the way people speak within that hierarchy, calling people sir or boss or whatever it might be. And clearly there are some, again, regimented traditions and practical activities that support that, whether it's inspections or whatever else it might be. I personally think that all of those are pretty superficial. I'm not suggesting they're unimportant, They certainly have a place within the military. I think they should be dumbed down as much as possible, and that rank should be carried as lightly as possible. And I apply that fully to the military. I'm sure I didn't always get it right, but I certainly tried to set that example myself. But I think if you move away from the superficial, what is the fundamental? The fundamental as a leader is that you are there to inspire people to be better than they would be if you weren't there yourself. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. You're not there for any reason. And I think that is agnostic to uniform or sector or background or industry. I think it fundamentally hinges on a series of things that are entirely transferable between any of those different domains, whether it's sector or industry or whatever. And they're things like care, they're things like example, they're things like moral courage, they're things like integrity, they're things like transparency, selflessness, and the list goes on. And we had a bit of a conversation in our previous podcast about the potential kind of naivety of romanticizing all of this stuff. And I don't think that is a romantic ideal or notion or vision. I think, as we discussed in the previous session, it ticks two boxes. One is it's quite simply the right thing to do if you have that awesome, and I use that in the traditional sense of the word, the genuine sense of the word. If you have that awesome responsibility for other human beings, it is the right thing to do to approach them in that way. But it's also the right thing to do on behalf of the organisation because it makes them better at what they do. And therefore, they and the organisation collectively become more successful. And I genuinely believe that those more philosophical, less superficial factors are just as applicable whether you're in Afghanistan with 4-5 Commando or whether you're in the Preston office of the Challenge, surrounded by people who would never conceivably have been in 4-5 Commando.
Quite often on this podcast, we talk about Adair's model of leadership with team, task, and individual, and the trying to find the balance of all three of those things. It strikes me that when you're talking about the superficial and the fundamental is the idea of doing the right thing and being the best leader you can for your people. The superficial is then applying that within the current context of the organisation. In my experience, in the military, I think it's still too simplistic to talk about a military style of leadership. I think it is very dependent on the current context. So I didn't command a unit, but I commanded a troop in combat in Afghanistan, and I felt that the style of leadership, perhaps those superficial elements of how you carry out that role, is very, very different in the dynamic and very real-time consequence situation of combat versus commanding a team back in camp where you're thinking perhaps more about development of the skills, balancing time across sort of 12 months, 18 months to try and develop the organisation. Do you think that's fair? And if that's the case, is this less a conversation about the difference between the military versus a civilian organisation? And this is more about the circumstance you find yourself in and the current task you have at hand.
And I like that. I think that's a really good hypothesis to start with. There is no such thing as a military style of leadership. That is actually a meaningless statement that doesn't add anything to the conversation. And as we have said, almost leads people down the path saying, well, of course, we're civilian, we're not military. So yes, Oliver, what do you think about
that? You're testing me now, guys. I mean, you're on a good, thoughtful, intelligently considered ground. What do I think about that? Yes, I mean, I understand Adair, and I also understand, which I think you're also driving at to a point there, Gareth, the concept of situational leadership. And I think those things are to some extent inevitable. I mean, if the house is burning down, I suspect I would probably be more directive with my family in terms of what I wish them to do at that point in time than, as I hope would normally be the case, if the house is not burning down. So I do see that, and I remember times on operations where there was a need to use the military vernacular, kind of grip in inverted commas, things, simply because the imperative for something to happen was just so high, and the premium at that particular moment in time to make that thing happen was so high. I have to confess that I think those are the exceptions, though not the rules. I think the rules are more the underlying tablets that support what I think is a persuasive way of leading, and therefore incentivizes people of their own volition rather than from a transactional perspective to want to follow. And those are the things I was talking about previously: care or example or whatever they might, loyalty, whatever they might be. And so I think the moments for situational leadership that kind of dials up this bit or dials down that bit are relatively rare, and actually consistency of approach is something that carries the day. Picking up a little bit on your point, Chris, I think you're right, sort of, and wrong, if I may say, with regards to your point about there's no such thing as a military style. I think there is such a thing as a military style. I think it does exist. I think it's a slight pity that it exists. I don't think it's necessarily does itself a huge amount of favours, but I think there is a school of thought, and I have experienced it and encountered it in my career, you guys may have done too, whereby the authority that is vested in you as a military leader, purely on the basis of your rank, allows you to lead in a certain way, because you can wield that rank, and you can therefore direct people what you expect them to do. And I've seen plenty of that over my career. I think that is ultimately an unsuccessful way of going about it, because I think that there are other ways of doing it that will be far, far more compelling to your people. But I think we shouldn't kid ourselves that kind of an approach doesn't exist, because I think it does.
Then I'm going to come back to the question, and I'd not thought about it before today, so I don't even know what I think about the answer. Do you think you could take an effective civilian leader, and could you transplant them successfully into the military? And I know we're going to talk about experience, which is where perhaps the domain experience is more important there, arguably. But I mean, look, there's some uncertain times in Europe, and all of a sudden the military might have to grow quite quickly at some point. And if we look back to the Second World War, bank managers quickly became captains and majors in the army who had to lead people. What's your view on that? And I think we share the same hypothesis, which is leadership. And while there are differences, fundamentally at its heart, good leaders are good leaders wherever you put them. To test that hypothesis, could you imagine what would have happened if, as the commanding officer of 4-5 Commando, they'd have said, we have to expand the unit rapidly, and as part of that, there are not enough soldiers to do that for us, and so we are going to bring external people, we're going to put them in uniform in a considered way, in a thoughtful way. What do you think the outcome would have been?
Well, I think that would have been slightly bizarre to have done that, because I think it would be very difficult to do that at a junior level, where the expectation is that you can rely absolutely completely on the person to your left and right hand side, because they've done 32 weeks of commando training, so they understand entirely how to apply a tourniquet in the event that you've lost a leg to an IED strike, or they understand entirely how to persuade a general purpose machine gun that's got too hot and become a runaway gun to calm down and start firing again. Those things I think are key. I think you have to know that the people at those moments have those skills, and I'd be very happy if that was a non-military person who had that skill set. That wouldn't trouble me at all. I was always pretty inclusive by outlook, but I think they probably would have had to have done 32 weeks of training, and therefore it wouldn't really change the dial.
You've left the door open, though. Let me do something just to see how much I can make Gareth twitch.
I know where you're going to
go. Intelligence where more and more there are technical capabilities. It's less about the ability to carry a weapon for 8 hours. I'm willing to. This sounds like I'm judging here. I think your logic on the expertise that a soldier requires is very physical and very specific, and that is a different world where it's much harder. In fact, we know there are ways you do that. You put people into training and do that. But in intelligence, when all of a sudden these days even the definition of intelligence is evolving, perhaps, Gareth, do you think, clearly you would not do this necessarily by initial choice, you could bring a civilian leader in and they could be an effective leader of a part of a military? Oh, he's looking very nervous.
I'm not at all. No, I think categorically, yes, you could. I mean, coming back to the initial question about dropping a civilian into 4-5 commando, I think this comes back to something we were talking about half an hour ago, which is skills versus mindset. And putting a cat tourniquet on a catastrophic bleed is a skill. Stopping a runaway gun is a skill. Those can be taught. That can be learned by anybody who's reasonably competent. That's not what we're talking about here. I think the mindset of understanding how to lead by example, what is important, caring for your people, I think it's irrespective of whether you've done 32 weeks of commando training or you've learned to be a leader by running a large organisation that sells fruit and vegetables. I don't think that matters too much. In terms of the context of the organisation, then yeah, there's skills that won't be transferable, and that would be exactly the same for a colonel, a general, a major, a corporal leaving the army, leaving the Marines, and going to look for civilian employment. You have to adapt. In terms of the intelligence question, I think there are examples of history where the military has adapted and done particularly well because of having people from different backgrounds. And we've talked many times before about the power of diversity. Having people who think differently, that challenge assumptions, that are more creative in their problem solving is really, really important. And the Second World War, the reason that British intelligence was one of, if not the most effective intelligence agencies in the world and led to some significant success was because they had an awful lot of military reservists who were bringing civilian skills into the fold. I think more importantly, though, it's this question of, do you have to learn the military style of leadership, or do you just learn leadership? Could you drop a very senior leader from a large, FTSE 100 organisation and drop them into a 2 or 3 star job within the military and expect them to be successful? I think, again, if they are, expected to warfight a division across a wet gap crossing with armoured brigades and armoured infantry units, then no, they probably wouldn't be able to do it. If you're asking them to lead an organisation through change management, they're probably going to be more effective than perhaps some of that.
Interesting. It feels like a really uncomfortable conversation. And I know that actually I think the three of us are pretty united in this, in which is there is real strength in this diversity and leadership is leadership. But even as we're talking about it, and I know civilian organizations are like this, which is we're already doing the caveats. We're already starting to talk about, and you can just see how people would say, let's just get someone who knows how to do this. It's fascinating. But perhaps a different question for you, Oliver, as well. If you thought,
can I just follow up a little bit on that one?
Yeah, please do.
Because I only answered your question head on because you asked about substituting people into 4-5 commando, and I think that's a little bit like asking, could you put non-nurses into frontline nursing roles within the NHS? And I wouldn't wish personally to go through something in the NHS if I didn't feel that the nurses were adequately qualified, which I think is sort of the point I was making. I don't find it an uncomfortable discussion. In fact, probably some of the most powerful people that I felt impacted positively in Afghanistan, and didn't General Odierno prove this with Emma Sky, were people who had no military background whatsoever. Zero. They had complementary skills that enabled the military to operate more effectively than otherwise it would have done. And I tried to surround myself by such people. Continuing that forward, could a civilian chief executive command at a 2 or 3 star level in the military? In my view, undoubtedly. I don't even have any caveat to add to that. Undoubtedly. Even if they had to do a challenging river crossing, wherever it might be that Gareth talks of, because they'll have lots of experts who can tell them how to do that. I think they could easily do so. And I think the military, and it is trying to do a bit more of this, to be fair to it, I think the military would benefit considerably from, at judicious, well thought through stages, the introduction of people with different backgrounds. Because at the moment, certainly in my career, and I think it is changing a bit, but in my career, it was everybody who'd been in the same stovepipe for however long, whether you'd got to the 10, the 15, the 20, the 25, whatever it might be, year point. And I think the introduction of some different thinking, as Gareth points out, and some different backgrounds at different points in time, it would be, and doubtless is, invaluable. So I have no problem with that thesis. My only caveat at the beginning was that I think those who are absolutely at the front line do need to have the skill set to be able to equip themselves there effectively.
So again, the premise of the podcast is that there's lessons to be learned on both sides. And I think this is going to be a very dull podcast for people, that we actually are in violent agreement about pretty much all of these points. But I'm interested, you made the transition into the civilian environment. And my experience and the assumption is, while the core skills to be successful and a good leader are true, there are differences. Can I ask a slightly different question?
Sure.
What did the new civilian environment do for you? What did you learn? Was it, well, this is effectively all I did was take a uniform off. What did you learn? What was new? What was different? What was perhaps surprising for you?
And can I add to that with another question as well, which is, if you could take those lessons back and retrospectively have your time again in the military, what would you have changed in the way that you were prepared to be a military leader, having learned what you've learned from the civilian?
Just the easy questions at the end.
No, they're good. They're good. And thanks for the follow-up challenge, Gareth, because it's a very good question, that, and it's something that you would hope that any young up-and-coming military leader would value thinking about. I mean, what did I learn? A vast amount. I'd sort of had my professional belief system rebuilt, and I will forever be unbelievably grateful to the challenge for that. What I experienced there, and there was the odd exception, because I'm a bit of a terrorist when I take over an organization, and I kind of I work extremely hard, and I try and look at it from every angle, and I sort of can't stop thinking about it. And one of the things I did when I went to the challenge was I read all the exit interviews to understand why people were leaving. And one of them said, I'm leaving because I'm not prepared to work for somebody who was in the military. And I thought, well, that's particularly socially inclusive for a social inclusion organisation. It caused me to slightly have my eyes out, and I didn't detect it ever again anywhere else. People who were really quite different from me, different backgrounds, different ages, different gender, the list went on, were extraordinarily welcoming. And slowly but surely, I just started to feel comfortable in the workplace again. And I owe the challenge an enormous debt for what it did for me, because I think it'd be fair to say with retrospect, although I didn't try and betray this or portray this particularly obviously to people, I think it was probably relatively invisible to people. I inside was in quite some turmoil and something of a mess. And slowly but surely that got sort of fixed. What was different, and this sounds a bit, I don't want this to sound like a throwaway line, because it would be easy to have apparently come to this conclusion, many, many years after the event. I'm being completely genuine and completely sincere. What was different was that the demographic was different. It was utterly different. The average age of a member of staff in the challenge was 27. Well more than 3/4 of them pretty much were female. And this was a completely new world for me. It was extremely ethnically diverse, particularly in the offices in Birmingham and London. It had an absolutely thriving LGBTQ community. I hadn't previously been on a Pride march. I hadn't previously found the requirement for every office to contain a prayer room. And those things suddenly became important. And as those things became important, I also had my eyes open to the fact that it's not just a cultural melting pot of cultures, which is wonderful in its own way. I grew up in Birmingham, which is a bit like that, but it's also a melting pot of ideas, because those cultures are all quite different, and because there are people from profoundly different backgrounds who just look at things in a different way and have a slightly different view and have a slightly different outlook. And, with retrospect, I felt and still do feel that military decision making, and I've talked about this before, which is vested in things called PGs, planning groups, so company planning group, commando planning group, brigade planning group, divisional planning group, so it goes on. Those PGs are largely staffed by people who are extremely similar to each other. So I played a significant role in two. One as the commando planning group when I was a CO, so I was the kind of boss of that, and one when I was the operations officer in a brigade planning group. So I was definitely not the boss of that, but I was quite a key player in it. And I'd say the players in those two groups were probably about 10 strong. They were all white, they were all male, they were all apparently straight. They were all educated roughly to the same level, and they all had broadly similar backgrounds. And so the diversity of outlook and opinion was almost non-existent. Genuinely almost non-existent, which is one of the reasons I was so keen to delegate the plan to everybody in 4-5 Commando. We talked about it last time, civilian, whoever. And yet at the challenge, if you walk down the corridor and ask the first 6 people you bumped into to pop into an office and talk about a certain issue, they would all be very, very different from each other, by background, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, education, whatever it might be. And so you would get a sort of just hodgepodge of ideas, which sounds slightly anarchic, and initially was a bit difficult to get your arms around it. Once you'd worked out that actually, one idea in 10 was probably awful and you could just disregard that, but 9 of them were really worth considering. And if you put all of that together, you could get to a really, really strong answer. I found that hugely energizing and dynamic, and very, very different from my experience in the military. So my advice to the military, and I've got very, very close personal friends now who are 3 and 4 stars, contemporaries of mine, is that you need to up the diversity dial dramatically if you possibly can.
I mean, clearly at the moment, politically, there's a huge thing where in the United States, they are actively trying to row that back. Are you finding that conversation a difficult one to have? Is there fear about the political blowback on that kind of conversation? And B, are you finding people entirely understand the premise and see this as, for want of a better word, increasing operational efficiency?
Yeah, so you alight on something very interesting and in my view very worrying that's going on at the moment. I mean, I recognise everything that you're describing to include the purge of the senior elements of the United States Armed Forces, people I've worked with and salted all over the world throughout my career. I have to say I wholly disapprove of the premise of what's being done out there. I think it's totally counterproductive and big steps backwards. And it's very easy to dress this stuff up in terms of anti-woke and all of that. That's not at all what I'm talking about. That's not where I'm going with this at all. I'm simply saying that I think diversity leads to more effective decision making and a more effective organisation as a result. I haven't yet detected that has hugely started to impact as a domino here. I've talked extensively with one of my friends who's recently been through a very senior process, job selection within the military, and much of that was built on this person's breadth of support for diversity in the broadest sense of the word all across the military, whether that's by gender, by activity, by ethnicity or whatever it might be. So I haven't yet found myself, Chris, having to have difficult conversations about that in this country, but I'd be perfectly prepared to if I needed to.
I mean, this is the thing that I think we've talked about time and time again, which is I think there are the people that mistake diversity as a sign of weakness, and there are others who see diversity as an opportunity for strength and a better outcome.
Right.
We're coming towards the end of our time, and as always, there are way more questions that are open than so. Perhaps we'll attempt to cajole you into coming back in a couple of months and we'll carry on the conversation. But I thought to finish us off, just before we started recording, a swamp-like monster appeared in front of us, who was my 17-year-old son, unkempt, seeking food, grunting as you would do. And I'm reminded that here we are, slightly older, attempting to be slightly wiser, but there's a constituent of people who are on the very beginning of their leadership journey, perhaps don't even know that the leadership journey is the one they want to take. If you could go back and meet your 18-year-old self, or indeed any other 18-year-old, and you think about a few words of wisdom that you could share, which, to be very clear, they would ignore blatantly because they feel they know it better, what few words of wisdom will you share, given what you've learned so far on your journey?
Well, I've got two swamp monsters of my own, age 20 and 17, so I totally understand that reality. Great and typically challenging question as I'm flagging towards the finish line of this marathon, Chris. I think I'd say to myself, or my equivalent at that age, on the basis of what I've learned, that there's nothing that is stronger than doing the right thing. I think that you have to be prepared to do that. There is no substitute for that at all. And I think the day that you stop doing that, even if the pressure is on, is the day that you become a much, much less capable leader than really you should be if you carry that sort of sacrosanct responsibility for other people. But I think I'd probably also say to myself, on occasions, carry it a bit more lightly. And, just be a bit more forgiving of yourself and of others, because, you have frailties, they have frailties, and, being sort of Somebody once talked to me about a concept of massive courage, which is what they felt that I had. And massive courage is not always a good thing. There is nuance, there is subtlety, and you can carry things more heavily than ideally you might wish to. So I would, the tablets of stone, which I think are moral courage and care for other people, and the preparedness to put other people before yourself, I think those can't change. But I think you can carry all three of those things, which are very difficult to do, of course. They're by no means easy, and no one does them perfectly. But you can carry all of those things in a way that is lighter than perhaps on occasions I have managed to do so. And if I had my time over again, I wouldn't have tried to improve on the former, because I think they're fundamental foundations. But I probably on occasions could have done better on the latter.
Oliver, thank you. I think those are, well, I'm going to suggest those aren't just good words for young people starting out on their leadership journey, but I think those are valuable words for anyone who's still, as we are, trying to figure out this leadership journey as we go. I also want to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank you for giving up your time for talking to us.
I
can give you a measure of how valuable we have found this conversation. Gareth talked about Adair's, how did you describe it?
Well, in this podcast, I was quite polite and said Adair's leadership model.
Thank you. When we snigger like adolescents and call them Adair's balls, I think we've even described that we want a mug with "I like Adair's balls" on them. So the fact that we refused to sully the conversation by talking about Adair's balls, there's a sign of thing. Just before we go, though, we've talked about your career in the military. We've talked a lot about your time in the civilian world. What's your latest endeavour? I would like to know what your latest endeavour is.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for kindly asking it. I wasn't expecting you to ask, and there was no need for you to do so. I'm sort of working it out is the straight answer. I'm setting up a business called Lunan Performance, which is about, which I hope to be doing not by any means alone, but with other kind of like-minded souls, which is about helping organisations to unlock the full capability of every person, such that the organisation therefore succeeds. I think far too many organisations, many, or all people in them, feel slightly trapped in a chrysalis and not fully able to fly with complete wind beneath their wings. And I think the trick to an organisation really flourishing is if everybody of their own choice, not because they're being ordered or told to do so, but because they choose to do so, wants to go the extra mile on behalf of the organisation. And that's essentially what Lunan Performance is about. There are lots of elements to creating that, but that's the proposition. Pleasingly, there seem to be quite a lot of people interested in having conversations about that, which is nice. I'm going to sit on a couple of boards. I've done a little bit of that before. I'm going to do a little bit more of that. And I'll keep sort of looking out and seeing what else interesting comes along. But a bit of this and a bit of that, I think, is the straight answer.
Well, we've really, really appreciated sort of the depth and breadth of the conversation we've had with you. And I think you've set out your leadership stall extremely well. If people did want to get in touch with you to give you more things to do, how might they get hold of you?
They can find it on the website, which is lunanperformance.com.
Oliver, thank you so much for giving up your time.
Yeah.
We are available on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. If you would like to get in touch with Oliver and you can't quite get through to him, please contact us via the email and we will pass it on to him. But also, more importantly, we would love to hear what you've got to say. We keep talking about diversity. At the moment, we are two white straight guys who are talking about leadership. We think there's probably room for a little bit more diversity in opinions, whether you agree or disagree. We're on Twitter at Battling with Biz, and we are also on Blue Sky. Please do, if you found this interesting, tell your friends. Please subscribe. And if this is the first episode you've heard with Oliver, please go back to our earlier episode where we talk more about his time in the military. And unsurprisingly, many of the topics we have talked about in terms of leadership, strategy, leading teams, building trust, there are many, many episodes.
Power of diversity.
Power of diversity. Please go back and listen to those earlier episodes that we've recorded. For now, though, thank you very much for joining us. Oliver, thank you for coming on and putting up with our ramblings. But we'll see you next time on Battling with Business.
Thanks very much. Cheerio.